The distribution of property and the problem of indebtedness are perennial problems of human societies, and they raise profound questions of justice. These are problems that are with us today in the aftermath of the housing crisis, which is fundamentally a crisis of indebtedness. And they were there at the very beginning of politics in the Western world, in Athens in the 590s, when Athenian society was riven by a divide between the rich and the poor, in which wealthy landowners were effectively in control of the society, and in which the poor had become indebted to the upper classes. Now, this was a conflict that would recur throughout the ancient world and beyond. And it was a conflict that was fundamental. The poor wanted two things. They wanted a cancellation of debts, and they wanted a redistribution of property. And that was the perennial slogan: cancel the debts and redistribute the land equally, fairly, between the members of this political community. The wealthy, by contrast, believed in their property rights. They believed that they had obtained their land fairly, that they had grown their property through just exchanges, that they had securitized their loan, which was the right of any creditor, and that they had simply collected the collateral of those loans. And so that is a fundamental problem, a problem of justice, when there are two conflicting claims, both of which carry some weight. And it was into that situation that the Athenians brought forth their great lawgiver, Solon. In 594, he was elected chief magistrate and was asked to grapple with these problems, to resolve them. And in the midst of this crisis, he forged a political solution that would not only bring Athens out of this crisis, but would set her on a new path towards democracy. Now, Solon's reforms were multifaceted. In one sense, they were constitutional. He completely overhauled the Athenian constitution, which was at that time a true oligarchy, ruled by a narrow band of wealthy families in what is known as the Council of the Areopagus. Solon created new institutions like the Probuletic Council that would consider legislation, something like a committee that considers legislation before it's introduced before a full assembly. He created new rules like the third-party prosecution. Now, this is one of the most democratic aspects of Solon's reforms, the ability of a third party to prosecute a crime. We've talked in previous lessons about how homicide law evolves from being a purely private matter of revenge to a publicly mediated system in which there are third parties, judges who can mediate. But Solon created a new institution of justice in which a third party could prosecute any crime. Now, that makes crime public. And Solon, in fact, says that he would wish that if a crime were committed, that any member of society would feel like they were a victim. That's the creation of a community, and it's a legacy that's with us to this day. And this is one of the most democratic aspects of Solon's reforms. He also creates an appeal to trial by jury, and not just any jury, but a popular jury. And the Athenian juries, enormous popular juries on which any individual citizen, regardless of property rank, could serve, would become one of the foundations of Athenian democracy. And so Solon carried through a series of sweeping constitutional reforms. But he also carried out economic reforms. And these too were fundamental, and we might even think of them in some sense as constitutional. Above all, he tried to solve the economic crisis by creating a fair system, a just system. And in fact, his solution, it was said, pleased nobody, because it didn't cancel the debts and redistribute property. It only did one of the two. He canceled debts, but didn't redistribute property. The cancellation of debts was in the interests of the poor, but it was of great annoyance and problematic for the wealthy who had lent their money. You can imagine in our own world how happy the banks would be if a politician canceled the debts. It would be unthinkable. At the same time, the poor were unsatisfied because they believed that the distribution of property, the distribution of land in this society, was fundamentally unjust. And so Solon, being wise, sailed away for 10 years to see if his laws would endure. In fact, some of Solon's reforms would endure, and others would fail over the years. But Solon was seen by the Athenians as the founder of their democracy. And indeed, it's his spirit of democratic equality that laid the foundations for the rise of full participatory democracy in Athens almost a century later.